Welcome back to the channel. We got this little 88 Mustang here in the shop and we're going to do a gear change. Now this is a real nice little car. It's got lots of upgrades, heads, cam, intake, exhaust and so on, but it actually feels a little bit doggy on the street. And the main reason for that is it still has the factory 273:1 gears. This is a really tall gear ratio. Ford did it for fuel economy, but it really hurts the performance. One of the most important things you can do to improve the feel of a car like this, improve its acceleration, is to upgrade the gears to a shorter gear set. That's a gear set with a higher numeric ratio. So this car has the 273 gears in it right now. We're going to upgrade it to 373 gears today. Now frankly, I never know whether I should be telling guys, oh yeah, this is an easy job, go ahead and do it yourself, or this is a really hard job and you're going to screw it up if you do it yourself. If you're a careful workman and you do it the way that I show you here, you'll get a good gear change. If you take shortcuts, if you screw things up, if you don't have the right tools, you're going to end up with a gear set that whines or maybe even worse. So go ahead and watch. I'll show you how it's done and you be the judge on whether you can do it yourself or not. Let's start out by talking about the special tools that you're going to need. First things first, you got to be able to get the car up in the air. It's very desirable if you have a two-post lift like this. You want to be able to get the car up in the air and hang the suspension, hang the rear end, so you can get it down low enough to work on it, to work on the gear set. It can be done on jack stands. If you do it on jack stands, you got to put the jack stands under the frame rails or on the body somewhere in order to be able to hang the suspension. And if you get to be an old guy like me, you don't even want to contemplate doing this kind of job on jack stands. It's, you know, not the most fun experience. Besides the hoist or some way to get the car up in the air with the suspension hung down, you're going to need a few specialty tools. This is a inch-pound deflection style torque wrench. That's inch-pound. I'm going to need this in order to check the pinion preload. If you try to do it with a click style torque wrench, you'll find that they don't click soon enough, the pinion preload sneaks up on you way too fast, and you end up over tightening the pinion nut, and you can't back the pinion nut off without throwing it away. So probably a tool you're familiar with, may already have, should have anyway, is a dial indicator. You're going to need this in order to get your backlash settings right, and use a magnetic base like this. That's an essential tool in order for measuring the backlash. I like to have a huge breaker bar like this. So this bar is, as you can see, closing in on almost as wide as the car. It's a 3/4 drive, and if you use a huge breaker bar like this, when you're setting the pinion preload, you will have much better control over that pinion nut. It avoids situations where you get it too tight, and it makes it a lot easier to handle the pinion nut, which requires, I don't know, 135 or 150 foot-pounds of torque in order to crush the crush collar. So my advice is get a really big breaker bar like this in order to handle the pinion nut. I've done it with a 1/2-inch breaker bar, you know, one that's only about that long. I've broken a 1/2-inch breaker bar doing it. I've put a piece of pipe on the end of a 1/2-inch breaker bar, but go to, this is a Princess Auto special, go to some place like that, Harbor Freight, whatever. Breaker bars are fairly simple tools. You don't have to buy a snap-on version and have something like this in your toolkit. Another thing that you're gonna have is a shop press. So if you don't have access to a shop press, or you don't have one in your shop, maybe it's time to get one if you want to start doing gear changes, or maybe you should end up leaving the gear change to a shop that has the equipment in order to make this happen. Another tool you're going to absolutely need is a bearing and seal driver kit like this. So these kits have specially sized aluminum, tapered aluminum heads. They got handle. You can actually, this one's pneumatic, it can't be hooked up to an air hammer, although frankly I don't think I would ever use an air hammer on this job. Use the regular hammer fitting. This is so you can drive the races into the rear end, and so you can put the pinion seal in. You need a kit like this if you're even going to contemplate doing the gears. In order to get the side bearings off the differential, you're going to need a puller or some way to get those side bearings off. You're supposed to be able to do it with a 2-jaw puller, and I have made that work in the past. Sometimes they're just froze on there, and the older these cars get, the more likely that stuff is to be frozen on there. So the typical way that I get them off these days is I use like a Dremel tool. Regardless of how you propose to do the side bearings, you need some kind of tools in order to get those side bearings off. So that's either a 2-jaw puller assembly that's gonna work with it, or it's like a Dremel tool with a cutting disc. You'll need a tool like that, a cold chisel, and a hammer. Besides all the specialty tools, of course, you're going to want to have a good selection of hand tools, socket set, hammer, and so on. I like to have a center punch to help me mark the caps when I take them off. And you'll also want to have a caulking gun, and then use a caulking gun style sealant on the rear cap. I use Right Stuff RTV. It's really the right thing to use. Costs twice as much as Ultra Black, but it's the stuff that really works. Use that with a caulking gun dispenser and you'll get a good seal every time. Parts wise, you're going to need the gear set, of course. My strong recommendation is that you use a Ford Racing gear set. If you do, you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble with setting up the pinion depth. If you don't, you're going to have to do the full meal deal on pinion depth. And you'll notice when I talked about tools, I didn't talk about a pinion depth finder. When you use the Ford Racing gears, 99.9% of the time, if you set them up with the same pinion shim that was in the Ford Racing set or the Ford set that you took out, you're going to get a perfectly fine pinion depth. If you use Motive or Yukon or somebody else's gears, you are going to really have to set the pinion depth, and that adds quite a bit of time to the job, and it adds some additional tools which I didn't even talk about here. So do yourself a favor, get the Ford Racing set. Ford Racing makes these gears all the way up to 456, so for the vast majority of you guys, there's a gear set that's going to work for you. The way these cars correct the speedometer is with the speedometer driven gear. So you'll need to get the driven gear that is specifically for your gear set. Now, this is a ratio of small integers. It is never going to be right on the money, but it's going to be pretty close, and this is the way it's corrected. You can't correct it electronically, you can't correct it with software. It's done with a gear. Well, if you have a late model Lincoln Mark 7, one of the later Lincoln Mark 7s, those speedometers and everything are all electronic, so they can be corrected with an Abbott electronic ratio adapter, but not for the Mustang. Use a gear. And you're going to need a master install set. This is a Raytech set. It's a perfectly good set. It includes the pinion bearings, the side bearings, shims, side shims and pinion shims, pinion nut and a crush collar, everything you need for the job. But let me tell you about one of the real gotchas that happens with this install. For years, Ford used the same pinion bearing in all of the 8.8s. And then, I don't know, it was like 2005 or something like that, they suddenly decided to change the pinion bearing, and they made a change. And they had like a 1 or 2 year pinion bearing, and then they changed to another different one for the later cars with an 8.8. So like if you have a late model that has an 8.8, it will use a different pinion bearing than was originally installed on this Mustang. Make sure that you get the old style pinion bearing. Your life will be a lot easier. This just reusing the pinion shim trick isn't going to work if you try and change to the new pinion bearing. And An absolute mistake that guys make is they think they're going to take a shortcut, not replace the races, and just put new bearings in. The new pinion bearings and the old style pinion bearings have a different angle, and they will not run the same on the races. If you use the old races with a new bearing, you have got nothing but problems. So get a set like this that includes the old bearing, or if you buy a Ford Racing Master install set, buy the separate pinion and bearing and race kit that's specific for these older 8.8s. You'll save yourself a lot of trouble. You're also going to need some gear oil. This is Valvoline, fully synthetic, 7590. I've used Mobil 1 a lot. That's my preference, but it seems like it's next to impossible to lay your hands on right now. Most of these synthetic gear oil sets like this include the friction modifier in them. So if you're using a Ford traction lock, which most of you will be, you don't need to worry about an additional friction modifier to go with it. The conventional wisdom is it takes 2 bottles of this stuff, but I can tell you from my experience, they never quite fill the rear end. It takes like 2 1/4, and sometimes you have a little spill or whatever and you lose a little bit of it. So buy yourself 3 bottles. Then you don't have to stop the job mid-job, go to the parts store and get another bottle of gear oil. So yes, you're going to have some left over, but it's better to have a little bit left over than be short. All right, once you get it up in the air, you're going to have to get the drive shaft off. You're going to have to get the wheels off. I suggest taking the drive shaft off first. These are 12 millimeter 12-point bolts. Put the car in first if it's a manual, or park if it's an automatic, and you should be able to break them loose. And you might find that in order to get them all, you'll have to turn this drive shaft a little bit. So with a hoist like that, like this, that'll mean putting it back down on the ground or almost on the ground, so you can disengage the gear shift, turn the drive shaft a little bit so you can get it last bolt, then re-engage the gear so you can get the last bolt. If you've watched this channel much, you know that I Ziploc bag everything. It's a good way to do this. Label this one drive shaft, start putting the bolts in there. Then I got a little box here started so that I can put all of the hardware that comes off of the car together. Now, it's also a good practice to take and mark the drive shaft with respect to the pinion flange. However, it doesn't really matter when we're doing a whole gear set because we're taking the pinion flange off too. So I wouldn't get too wound up about doing that mark. I usually do just for giggles though. Okay, it looks like I had this rotated just right so that I was able to get at all the bolts here. Before I take the last one out, I'm just going to put a paint stick mark on there. Like I said, it's a good practice. It's not really necessary in this case because we're going to disturb everything. But we're going to go ahead and pull this drive shaft out at the front. Now I got a fresh Ziploc ready here to protect the yoke on the transmission end. And first we'll have to relieve it from the pinion flange a little bit, move it ahead, swing down. If you're just a little bit lucky, it clears. Let's say the transmission's a little bit over full. Look at that. We'll bag this, get this part out of the way. Careful not to drop it. This is steel drive shaft. Don't drop that. If it's aluminum or, God forbid, carbon fiber, definitely don't drop that. Okay, you're probably going to want air tool for this. And make sure that you have any wheel keys that are needed. If you try to take these lug nuts off with the drive shaft disconnected, you're not going to get them with a wrench. You're gonna have to take the drums off too, because you're gonna have to pull the whole axle out. So let's see if this drum would just come. Looks like it's probably froze on around there. So the drum on the other side just slid off, which is not uncommon. This drum's being a little sticky. So I've squirted a little bit of fluid film around the hub here, which is a place that probably will be sticking. And then I'm going to give it a couple taps with a soft face hammer and see if that's enough to free it up. But I'd say there's a pretty good chance that the problem with this is that the drum is rusted to the hub, not that the brake is actually dragging. Soft face didn't work. I'm going to try brass drift. And this is the kind of stuff that you run into when you do these jobs. It just doesn't want to come apart. My guess is the most likely problem here is that this hub is rusty. So we'll try a little gentle heat. Gave it quite a few good whacks. Now I've put some heat on it here. I can start to see it move. I think we're going to get it. There we go. It's not really grooved, just rusty. Okay, now you got the car up in the air, you got the drive shaft off, you got the wheels and the brake drums off, or if it's a disc conversion, you got the rotors and whatnot off so you can get at the axles. What you're going to find here is there is no drain for the diff. The only way to drain the fluid is to take the bolts out. Having the sway bar off is going to definitely help with access to the rear end here further along in this job. Take a screwdriver here and we'll kind of gently pry on this. Wow. If the last guy in here wasn't a he-man, you should be able to get that off. Now this is stuff you want to keep clean. A little bit of thread locker on there. That's okay. We'll turn this down like that and try and push this shaft through like that. And I'm going to turn this so we can see. The axles in this setup are held in by what's known as C-clips. So if you look in there, you can see on the left, I've kind of got the axle stub illuminated. If I push that axle in, you'll see that it reveals a little clip. And what you want to do is reach in there and grab this little clip, depending on how it's actually oriented. We'll get it out of there. There we go. You see that? That's what holds the axle in. So you pull those C-clips on each side, then you can remove the axles. And you should try and be careful with this, not to screw up the wheel bearing, the outer wheel bearings. Pull this out, support it. As you pull it out gently, then just set it aside. I always set it down standing up. And that will give you access to the seal and the outer wheel bearing if you had to have it. So here's another little tip for you. When you got the axles out, go ahead and slip this shaft back in place. And that'll help keep all this stuff together as you're working on it. Your next step is to pull the caps. And you will see the caps are marked with an arrow that points out. But what you want to do is put the left cap on the left side and the right cap on the right side when you put it back together. So you're going to want to mark these in a way that's indelible and that you're not going to screw it up when you put it on. And the typical is to use center punch to put a mark on the housing and on the cap. And I don't just see any markings here in spite of this thing's been opened up. So, I mean, looks like it's factory gears probably. Who knows? Maybe they just changed the oil. But let's get a center punch and we'll put a couple little marks on here. Their objective is to just put a little dimple. There's a little dimple in the cap, one, and I'm going to put a little dimple in the housing there. So now there's one dimple there, one dimple there. Then on this side, I want to put two dimples. So now those caps are marked. There's a physical little dimple right there and one right there. And on this side, there are two physical little dimples there and two there. So that can't rub off, suddenly disappear. That's going to allow you to reassemble this correctly. Okay, now it's main cap time. So we're going to back these bolts off. They're 3/4. Normally, these rear ends, these differentials, are in here very tightly. There should be a preload on the side bearings here, which basically locks them in place. On some of these older cars, all the preload will be gone from the side bearings, and the center section can almost fall out on your head. So you gotta watch out for that. I want to try and keep this stuff together left for right. Pull that cap off, don't drop the cap. Now the other thing you're going to find is, especially if it was set up by Ford, there's going to be a heavy cast shim on each side. Keep those separated so that you have the one that's on the left side in the left bag and the one that's on the right side in the right bag when it all comes out. Now I'm going to push this catch basin out of the way because we're getting ready to actually drop this thing. I've got a clean receptacle set up. It's just a drip tray, but it's all been cleaned up. So that's where I'm going to put the differential when it comes out. Now these caps are cast, so don't drop them. Okay, that's not falling out anyway. Now let's see if it'll just come. No. So you can use a pry bar in there to pry on this, or you can try this old mechanic trick where it doesn't always work, but sometimes you put a 3/4 or box end wrench over one of these, and then a 3/4 box end wrench over one further up, and pry. I think I moved that just a little bit actually. My usual game plan is to do it like this, but you want to be a little bit cautious about. There, it is moving a little. Okay, I'll be a little bit cautious about damaging stuff here. Now, like I said, you got these two heavy shims here, and you got the races and everything. When you bring this out, try and keep that stuff organized, left for right. That one we put in our left bag, and that one we put in our right bag. And if it's multiple shims, because someone's been in here and used a aftermarket shim kit, That's okay. Try and keep them together because it gives you some kind of a starting point reference for putting this back. That's all apart but the pinion itself. Okay, the last major disassembly task, besides races and whatnot inside there, is to get this pinion flange and nut and everything off. It's a 1 1/16 nut, and the way to do this is with an air wrench. There you go. When you use punches like this to hold it in place, try and use the holes that you're not actually using. There's our nut. Can't reuse that nut. There's our flange. Our pinion will pull out from the other side. So then there's our pinion. It should just pull out. Never say it will, I guess. Sometimes it ends up stuck on the bearing. If that's the case, put your pinion nut, just thread your pinion nut back on. And then use a soft face hammer to gently tap it through. There. It's doubtful that anybody's going to reuse this 273 gear set, but there's no point mushrooming the threads on the pinion. There we go. There's our huge pinion. Then I'm going to clean out the housing. We're going to remove the races, the old pinion seal, the small pinion bearing, and the race for that. Then we can go ahead and start reassembling everything. So there's a couple of remaining disassembly steps. We're going to take this pinion seal out. There's going to be an oil slinger in behind there, which you want to make sure you don't lose. I'm going to put a piece of shop towel down on the floor here so that when those parts come out, I can put them down there. When we take the pinion seal out, we'll get that front pinion bearing and the oil slinger out of there. I think the best way to do this is with a little hammer and a little chisel like this. You kind of get tapped under the edge of the seal. And you got to go around. You can see it's starting to work loose there, and then I can kind of work up here, prying on it a little bit. If possible, I'd like to avoid having this all just drop on the floor. There we go. Okay. So that's the seal. We're not going to reuse that. I'm going to put it down there. This little deal here is the oil ring, and it goes between the seal and this small pinion bearing. Don't forget this or you'll end up with a leak. And in fact, when I get done, what I usually do, just to remind myself, is put a piece of tape on the housing here with the words oil slinger on it so that I don't forget when I go to put it back together. Well, this isn't the easiest thing to see. This is one of the races. This is the other race here. If you look carefully in there, you can see there's a little divot out of the side of the casting and the housing. That is specifically so that you can get, it's on either side, it's specifically so that you can get your punch in there to drive that race out. There, you can see it there as well. So you're going to stick a punch where that little cutaway is in the casting and hammer this race out. You hammer one out from one side and one out from the other. So that's what we're going to do next. So we'll get our Big punch in there and our hammer. And we'll start hitting that. The race should start to move. You should alternate from side to side. There we go. And we'll go around the back and do the same thing from the other side. Goodbye. The housing's always going to be grungy in there. You're going to have residual oil, lubricant. I like to start by kind of mopping it out. But we got to clean this up. No sense in just putting the gears back in a dirty housing. And by the way, the reason you use a center punch to mark these cap locations is because if you wrote on here with a marker or something, when you go to clean this up, you're going to rub off any markings you put on there that aren't physical markings. So this is just a little brake clean. Try not to leave residue from shop towel in there. When you have the thing apart, you should always look at your outer bearings and seal. Everything looks okay with that on this car, and it's not a part of the quoted job to replace that stuff. It's also not a part of your master install kit. Lots of times it'll be okay. If you have an older car, sometimes it isn't. My Mark 7 sitting over here, for example, had a leaky outer seal, and that needed replacing. Now you might have seen guys take these out with a slide hammer. Yes, you can do it that way. But when you got the whole rear end gutted like this, the right approach, I think, is you use a long bar like this, or this is a piece of thick wall pipe. You stick it through, and then you use a big hammer and you just drive the bearing and seal out. Then you can put it back in. This is the no muss way to do it, but you have to have a bar that's a little bit longer than the width of the whole rear end so that you can shove it through and then still get on it with the hammer out here. I have taken these apart with a puller. That's the way you're supposed to do it. If you guys have that work every time, you're luckier than I am, because I've also had days where I'm doing this and broke 2 pullers, couldn't make it work. So I found that the path of least resistance, something that works every time, is to use a Dremel like this. It's got a metal cutting disc, and then I have the flex shaft attachment, which makes it a little easier to handle. I'm going to cut the outer bearing cage off. Now you're going to get little bits of bearing everywhere. Well, that's okay. Our next objective is to cut through the inner race here. And we're going to try and do that at one of these slots that's made for the bearing puller. We don't have to cut all the way through, but get it scored heavily. Then we're going to use a cold chisel and a hammer to strike it and break that inner race. Then it'll just come off. So let's see how we do with that. Yeah, okay. So that broke it. And that's off just that easy. So it actually, I didn't touch the inside here at all. I cracked it right through here, and it came off. I'll tell you, after you spent 2 hours trying to get it off with a puller, you wish you knew this trick. Okay, so we got those side bearings off. The next thing is to get the old gear off of here. An air wrench is your friend for this. And I always try to do it in a crosswise pattern. This gear was probably pressed on, and you can press it off, or especially when we're not going to reuse it, you can gently tap in opposite holes with a big hammer. This is a good way to start, I think, with a hammer. If it doesn't work, use a press. There you go. So this part's going to be reused. I'm going to clean it off a little bit here, then we can start reassembling it. Cleaning it up just makes it a little more pleasant to work with, for sure. Always a good idea, I think, to clean stuff up. And you definitely want these surfaces here to be nice and clean. The next thing we want to do is get this pinion bearing off so we can measure the shim that's put between the pinion bearing and the pinion head. We're going to do that in the press, and in order to make this happen, we're going to use a bearing remover tool like this. So that's going to slide on behind the bearing. So you'll end up with an assembly that looks something like this. We're going to tighten this up, obviously, but the bearing remover will go on behind the pinion. Hopefully we get it behind the actual race. Then we can put this whole assembly in the press and press the pinion bearing off. Then we can get at that shim and measure it. So a press can be a precarious kind of a system. You've got to have this set up so you've got enough travel that you can force this bearing off. You've got to be prepared for just the outer cage to come off initially. If you're trying to save the gear set or whatever, you want to be sure that it's not just going to fall out and smash on the floor, that you've got something soft for it to fall on or something to catch it. Get your pinion centered on the press. I always put a piece of flat bar between the end of the pinion and the press to try and protect the gear set as much as possible. Go slow, try and stay out of the way in case something happens. Oh, and for sure, wear safety glasses for this. So, I think it's moving. Yep, it looks like it's moving. So then I'm going to hold it, because it does look like it's moving. And it's a friction fit, so the more it moves, the less pressure it should take. And if we're lucky, we set this up high enough so that, there, it'll come off. All right, there we go. There's our old bearing. So the prize out of this exercise is this, which is the original pinion shim. So I'm going to give it a wipe, and I'm going to measure it with a caliper. So this is like 0.215 or, sorry, 0.0215 or 0.022. Okay, once you've got your pinion shims or shim selected, it's time to go ahead and press the pinion bearing on. Let's put just a little bit of gear lube around the pinion to help it slide smooth. So we'll just kind of give this a little lubrication. And we're going to put just a little lubrication on the inside here. When you go to do this, you're going to want to have the inner race from an old pinion bearing. So that's what this is. We're going to set the press up so it presses on these surfaces on the old inner race. That's going to press inner race to inner race so that we're not putting any pressure on the cage. That's something we want to avoid, is putting any pressure on the cage. Then we'll press it on until it's on. So set this up so it's more or less centered. We're going to put a plate over the head there, so we're not directly on the head. All right, and then when you're close like this, you're going to recheck everything. Make sure that you're centered as well as you can be centered. Make sure that that is not on the bearing cage. Now you should see it go on square. If there's any issue, stop before you wreck something. It's not taking a whole lot of force, so as long as it's not taking a whole pile of force, you can just keep going. If it starts to get extra stiff, you should probably stop and have a look at what's going on. Okay, then when you're there, apply a little bit of extra force just to make sure that that is absolutely on there. Relieve the press. There you go, new assembled pinion. Now, it's not a bad plan to just look in there and make sure that that really did tighten up, which it did. So we're ready to move on to the next thing. We're going to start by giving the ring gear a quick rinse off here. Brake clean. Look for any debris, defects. Sometimes there's little bits of styrofoam from the box. Get all that out of there. This is a trick that you should probably do just to make sure that there are no burrs. So you just gently go over it with a flat file like this. Because if when this was made there ended up being burrs on this surface, it won't sit down flush on the differential housing, and that will cause problems. Your finger is one of the best guides. So you just run your fingers over there. Okay, looks good. Now your objective isn't to remove a bunch of material, just to remove burrs if there are any. More often than not, when you go to put the gear on, I mean, it's going to need to be pressed on. You can suck it down with the bolts a little bit if you want, but what we're really going to do here is put enough bolts in to be sure that everything's lined up. Then if it doesn't just go on easily, then we'll go ahead and use the press and press it on, then finish tightening the bolts up. Check how square you're getting it. Now sometimes you don't actually have to use the press. This might be one of those times. You do want to make sure that this is square. So we got that started. Now we're going to want to Loctite these, and we've got to torque them. You've got to get between 71 and 84 foot-pounds of torque on these. It's not the easiest task in the world, so here's a little trick that'll make it easier. With just the stuff you're for sure got laying around. Put down the wheel, put one of the axles in the wheel, stick the differential in the axle, then it'll make it easier for you to hold this while you're trying to torque it. Now these bolts have got to have Loctite on them, so what I'm going to do is I've got it roughly in place here. I'm going to take these out one at a time, put Loctite on, put them back in just snug, Loctite all the others and put them in, and then I'm going to start going around and I'm going to torque them down in a crossways fashion in several steps until I get it into the acceptable range. This is blue medium thread locker. And you should try to work fairly quickly once you're dealing with the Loctite I prefer this Loctite gel paste, whatever it's called. The runny stuff in the tube just runs away, so this stuff stays with the part. So all of those started cleanly with my fingers. That's good. We'll just have a final look here. Looks nice and even. So we're going to move on to the torque wrench. So I've just set this for 15 initially here. Okay. So that should be snugged. Let's try 40 foot-pounds. Okay, 75 then. This is where you're going to have trouble. Whew! All right. That'll tire you out. If you do it this way, you'll get it done. If you try to do this just on the floor or whatever, you're never going to get the requisite torque on here. We put 75 foot-pounds on here. These bolts are not going to back off. That's within the range, and it'll be good. We got to put the side bearings on. So we're going to start with this side, and like we did with the pinion, put a little lubrication on there, and the inside lubed up. And we've got a old inner race. Put our plate on there. You want to try and get this dead center if you can. And you really got to watch these, that they are going to go on square. So don't just set it up and then start jacking for all it's worth. Pay attention to what you're doing. And I don't care how carefully you think you have this set up. Use eye protection. Once it starts to get centered on there, it'll go on. But it is easy to get this not square. And just give it a little extra. Make sure it's tight. You cannot have a gap. That's our differential assembled and ready to go in the car. Up in here, this is the part of the housing that this pinion race is going to go in. That's the pinion race. What we got to do is we've got to get that pinion race driven into that cast housing. And we're going to use a tool like this. This is a seal and race driver with a hammer. Stick that in the race, and we're going to drive that in. Now, it's easy to get this going in off center. If it is, you've got to stop, pop it back out, and start again. This housing feels okay, but sometimes there'll be a burr on there. Sometimes you will have marked it with your punch when you punch the old race out. So if there's any kind of a burr or whatever, you should dress it with some emery cloth or some very light sandpaper, because if there's a burr there, it's really going to wreak havoc with being able to actually drive that race in. First things first, I'm going to get a little bit of gear oil out of this old bottle, and I'm going to lubricate the channel that we're going to drive the race into. Now, you don't want there to be any debris in here, but don't underestimate the power of a little bit of lubricant. I'm going to put a little bit of lube on the race itself, on the outside surface, so we think we're squared up. Let's after a couple blows like that, it's not a bad plan use a caliper. Check your depth on each side. To see if it's going in square. And it's not. It's going in cockeyed like that. I'm going to try and apply a little bit of force on that, just on that side. That's way closer to square. Once you really get it squared up and starting to go, it'll go. Don't get too aggressive until then. And if you're hitting it offset like this, don't let that little bolt touch the race. Okay, I'm going to put this back in the center of the race and see. So at some point it'll stop. You need to double check that you've got it flush in the back there. So we're going to wheel around the front and look in through there. Looks good. So we're going to move around, do the one in the front. It's the same procedure, although it's smaller and it's usually a little easier. Usually goes in a little straighter. Okay, we've almost got this housing prepared. So when you're ready to go here, put in your bearing, your oil slinger, put your seal up there, put your seal driver on, and then start driving the seal in. When we're in that far, we'll just pull off, have a quick look around that it's going in clean, looks fine. Everything's fine there. So let's get that driven in flat. Everything's in. All right, so we're ready to put the pinion in. What I have done is I put a little gear lube on the bearing, spun it around a little bit just to make sure that's lubed up. Double check that the race is clean. We're going to take our crush collar, the one that came in the Ford kit, and put that on there. Now, then we're going to stick it through. We're going to put the companion flange on the other end and put the pinion nut on, the one that came in the Ford kit, and start tightening that down. Now the idea here is this is a spacer and it will actually crush. That's why it's called a crush collar. So when we put that in and start tightening it down, after we get the slack out, the play out, it's going to start to get very difficult to tighten this down because you're actually crushing this thing. It's going to take like 140 plus foot-pounds to crush that. And we're going to crush that until we achieve a minimum preload on the pinion bearings, which we're going to measure with our inch-pound torque wrench. That preload spec is 16 to 29 inch-pounds for new bearings. In my experience, what you're trying to shoot for is as close to 29 as you can reasonably get, but don't go over. So my target is always about 25. We'll just stick that through. We're ready to put the companion flange and pinion nut on here. I just want to draw your attention to the way I have this set up. We're doing this on a 2-post lift. You're going to be putting a lot of force on the rear end to crush that crush collar. So use tall jack stands like this under the housing to support the housing. You don't have to have a bunch of pressure on them. You don't have to have the springs compressed, but you want this housing to be supported. So when you're pulling on it, you're pushing against the jack stand rather than, say, twisting the car and potentially making it fall off of the lift on you, because that's a real bad day if it falls off the lift on you. So safety first. This is definitely the way to do it. If you're doing it on jack stands, similarly, I'd put a jack stand under the housing just to support it when you tighten this. This is a step you'll really be hating yourself for having jack stands for, though. Okay, so we're going to slide our companion flange on here. And I'm just going to reach around inside there. Then I'm going to take my pinion nut and start it. Now there are pinion holders. I have one for the companion flange on like S197 cars, but you can do it this way as well. If you're using punches like this, stick them in the holes that aren't the ones you're going to be using for your drive shaft. Remember, it's a 1 1/16 nut, so we're going to start just with a ratchet here. So you feel that tighten up. It got really tight. That's because we've taken the slack out and we're now on the crush collar. So I'm just going to give that a quick turn. And we can still see we got lots of play there. But we're at the point where we're going to start crushing the crush collar. So we're going to move on to our He-Man tool. So this is a 3/4 inch breaker bar. We're going to put that on there. And what you're going to find is it's going to take quite a bit. As long as there's play there, you are not close. And you see how this would be a real pain on jack stands. Now I'll show you an initial preload check. We still have a little bit of play there, so we know we're not at the right spot. But what you're going to do to check the preload is you're going to put your inch-pound torque wrench on, and you're going to turn this, and you're going to read the deflection. And we're looking for that to take about 25 inch-pounds to rotate. That is the preload. What's really deceptive here is you're turning and turning, and you're just taking up slack and crushing that crush collar. And then suddenly you'll have all the slack out of it. And that preload is going to come on really fast. One of the reasons to use this huge bar is because you got more control. That feels like our play is gone. And now it's important to keep checking because, like I said, it's going to sneak up really fast. So right now that shows, I don't know, maybe 6 inch-pounds. That's just a frictional force. It's not really a preload. As soon as it begins to come up off of the pin, off of the, just friction setting, like say we see 10, we got to start going really, really slow. And this is where if you're trying to do this with a click style torque wrench, you're never going to get it right. I'm only turning that a few degrees. 5 degrees, 7 degrees. I'd call that about 12. So what you're going to see now is, now that we're starting to get a genuine preload on there, this is going to tighten up with very little more turning of the pinion nut. So we want to be very judicious as we're trying to get to 25. That's a really tiny amount, 3 or 4 degrees. So rotationally, I'd call that about 18. You saw how tiny of an amount that was that I went, like 3 or 4 degrees. We went from like 12 to 18, and our target is 25. So you got to be really, really careful here. And this is where, if you got a short bar, or you don't have good control, you are going to over tighten it. Plus, you're only just getting to the stage where a click style torque wrench might click. 20 or 22. Okay, this is in our target range of 16 to 29, but as a general rule, you want to try and get these on the tight side if they're going to run smooth. This thing's going to wear in a little bit. It's going to loosen up. And if it loosens up too much, you lose your preload. Then you start to have play in there. You don't want to be past 29, all right. But you'd sure like to be, like this is 20 or 22. We'd sure like to be just a little more than this. But we got to turn this like 1 degree. I'm going to get up where I can really see here. See this? It breaks away about 29 and pulls 24 to 25, steady all the way around. That's our setting. Now it's going to feel tight, and it should. That's our setting. Pinion set up. Now we can move around and start doing the carrier. When you're ready to put the carrier in, my suggestion is lay out all your parts and tools like this, all in order, left side, right side. That's so you can reach everything and you're not going to drop it. It's a kind of an awkward thing to put in there, so you want to be able to get at everything all at once. If you're doing it in your driveway, you're probably not going to have a lot of choice on the height that the car is set at. With the 2-post, I can change the height. If possible, try to get this at a height where it's easier for you to manage, because this is kind of an awkward thing, especially putting it in and out, and chances are you're going to be putting it in and out a few times in order to get the backlash correct. I've taken the tall jack stands away. We don't need them anymore. We're not putting a huge side load on things, and we're going to start loading it up. So I'm going to take the differential. I'm going to put the side bearings on, the races. And I'm going to take one of the factory spacers. I'm going to lift the thing up in here like that. And try to keep my fingers out of the way. And then kind of slide the whole thing together. So now I've got the factory spacer on the left side. I'm going to take my cap. Remember, it's got arrows that point out, and we marked it with 2 ticks. Put a bolt in. By the way, off camera, I cleaned up these caps and bolts and everything. So we've got that, so it's not going to fall out. Now the next thing is, we'll try our 2 original spacers. What you're going to try to do is get this race sort of pried up in there, and then we'll try this spacer here. Now these spacers are cast, so be a little bit careful with them, but you're going to have to tap them in with a soft face hammer. If those spacers were right, just judging by how much drag that is, I bet we got the right preload. You put your other cap on. When you have these big factory spacers, that's the way to get started. Oh, by the way, one of these caps had a little bit of burring on it. So I used a file to dress that burring. Just gently. You don't want to remove any material that isn't sort of abnormal. You want them to be snugged. But you'll feel, there, it tightens up a little bit. I go just a little bit past where it tightens up. Just a little bit past where it tightens up. And that's going to be good enough for our backlash check. And what we're going to look for is how much this gear set moves. So you hear that? That is the play that's in the gear set. And that's called the backlash. The first check, of course, is that there is some backlash. Because if there isn't any play, then it's set up too tight and you're going to have to take it out, change your side bearing spacers, and then get it so that there is some backlash that you can work with. But in this case, you can see there is a little bit. So our next step is to set up the dial gauge on there and get a measurement of it. I spun this over a few times, rechecked it, and I think really I got about 13 or so here. That says 85 or just beyond. It says 71, that'd be 14. Let me go over some of the adjustments you would make to get this backlash correct. Okay, first things first, when you put it together, you put in, well, the factory shim on the left, or 265 thou shim on the left, nominal if you're starting from scratch. Then you start adding shims to the right until the final shim inserts with just a slight drag. That doesn't mean hammer in like I did here. That means a slight drag. So that's just the slack taken out of the side bearings. You've got to hammer it in. That's about what you need for your preload. Once you've got that in, if there's zero backlash, if it doesn't have any movement there at all, take 20 thou off this side, add 20 thou to this side. That's going to move the ring gear to the left. It's going to increase the backlash until you've got some backlash, and then you can start measuring it. Then to increase the backlash, you're gonna take shim away from here and add shim here in the same amount. To decrease the backlash, you're going to add shims on the left and take them away on the right in the same amount. And to give you some idea, if you want to make a backlash change of 5 thou, then you want a shim thickness difference of 6 thou according to the book. So these are just little changes. Now, if you installed the shims so that the final shim installed with just a slight drag, so that you're only taking the slack out but not adding any preload, then the final steps are to add 6 thou shim to each side. That creates the preload. And you'll find in practice what that means is you've got to tap it in with a soft-faced hammer, just like you saw me do here. That's about the right amount of tension to get the preload. Don't just try and add a 6 thou shim though, because these tiny little thin shims are going to bend or break. You've got to have some thick shims. When you're doing your preload, you're going to put in whatever 6 thou more. Usually it's not 1 6 thou shim. It's usually increasing the size of some bigger shim by 6 thou. Then you're going to hammer in the thickest shim you have last, usually on the right hand side. If you try and hammer in one of the thin shims, it's just going to bend. You're going to have never-ending problems. So I pulled that out and I measured these shims. The ones that are in there are 275 on a side. And it was a fairly hard pull to get out. It's probably just about the right amount of preload. So if we think we're 13, we need to take 5 or 6 off. I'm going to put 280 on the left side and 270 on the right side. Now that moves the ring gear over 5 thou, which should give us 4 or 5 thou of backlash improvement. Oh. Okay, after quite a bit of monkeying around, that's 7 or it's 8 depending on where you set it up. That's right at the tightest it should be. So I think we're going to call that a day. Torque the cap bolts in a couple of steps, starting with 30 foot-pounds. Finish torquing the cap bolts at 80 or 85 foot-pounds. Right, for a final step, paint a little pattern grease on there, and we'll turn this over a few times. So I don't think we got too much wrong with this pattern. It looks pretty even across the face. All right, it's time to put our axles back in. So you're going to slide the axle in from the side, just like how you took it out. Support it. Push it all the way in. You're going to slide the C-clips in, then you're going to just push those axles outboard slightly, then reinstall that shaft. So let me get in here with C-clip, and we can go push that outboard. Turn the rear end back over a little bit, and I'm going to put a little Loctite on this retainer. We're going to slide the shaft back in the hole at this end. Line that up with that little bolt. We're ready to put some right stuff on here and put the cap on. Okay, I wire wheeled the cap cover bolts, cleaned up the cover. I got some Permatex Right Stuff RTV here. This is the good stuff for this, even though it's twice as much money as Ultra Black. Got a pretty good angle tip cut, and I'm just going to start up at the top, and I'm going to go around on the inside of all the bolt holes. With a nice steady bead. Especially on these lower ones, I'm going to go around these holes just a little bit. Grab a couple of bolts, bring the cover up. We'll try without too much smearing around. As usual, when you got RTV involved, you should work expeditiously. So we're going to just kind of run these down roughly in a crossways pattern. There's a torque spec. It's 25 to 35 foot-pounds. We're going to go to the torque wrench now, and now we're going to try and run these down crosswise to about 10. So let's go crosswise, and we'll go about 10 foot-pounds. Let's set the torque wrench to 25. And okay, so I think they say you can put this right stuff in service in like an hour or two, something like that. But if there's any way, you should leave it sit overnight before you put the fluid in. It'll really reduce your chances of generating a leak. Okay, so one remaining thing you got to do here is change the speedometer gear. We got this 21 tooth gear to put in here. We got to take this off. The gear's on the inside there. We'll switch the gears. Take out that one little retaining bolt. Then this whole assembly should pull out. You see there's an O-ring on there to seal that. So this is just held on with this little retainer. You're just going to pop that off. You can do it with your fingernail. Set that down. Pull the gear off. Slide it on. Then it's a good idea to check that it turns free. I have seen these where they want to bind a little bit, and then the finer the teeth on here, the more likely it is to break. So you don't want there to be any binding on there. So that turns good and free. And I think you can see, in spite of the fact that these are both essentially red, I don't know, this is a little bit different color. Maybe it's supposed to be brown. They have a very different tooth count. And that's what's going to correct our speedometer. Slide that in, and it should slide in easy, like that. We'll put our bolt back in. That's all you got to do to correct the speedometer. Okay, well that's basically the gears job. We'll put the sway bar back on, put the wheels back on, put some fluid in the differential, put the drive shaft back on, and we're ready to enjoy our new 373 gears. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, hit that notification bell so that you won't miss out on future videos.